Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon.
Doc, I'm from the future. I came here in a time machine that you invented. Now I need your help to get back to the year 1985.
My guest today is radio and television host Brad Gilmore. Since 2011, he has been the host of The Brad Gilmore Show, which covers the worlds of sports, music, and pop culture. Brad also hosts the Hall of Fame with WWE Hall of Famer Booker T, and that's on ESPN Radio. He is truly a media renaissance man, hosting a variety of TV shows and podcasts, including The Reality of Wrestling, Heated Conversations, featured in the iTunes Top 10 podcast chart, and since 2015, Back to the Future, the podcast, which just recently surpassed 1 million streams. Amazing. He is also a writer, recently penning a book on our favorite time-traveling trilogy, Back from the Future, a celebration of the greatest time travel story ever told. And that will be our topic of discussion today. Of the book, Back from the Future, Mark Ellis, comedian and movie critic, says, Brad Gilmore's book not only offers new perspectives and a deeper understanding of Back to the Future, it reminds us of why we fell in love with it in the first place. The book is available in hardcover, but on December the 2nd, Back from the Future will be released in paperback with all new information and an entirely new section. And we are very pleased to have the radio, TV, and podcast host and #1 best-selling author with us today. Welcome, Brad.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited, too. As we talked just a second ago, the 1980s, I grew up during that time period, and I absolutely love it. The beginning of your book, you talk about Back to the Future trilogy being the greatest movie trilogy of all time. Now, there's some pretty good ones out there. Make your case right off the bat for the Back to the Future trilogy.
Okay, look, I'm well aware that there are great trilogies out there. You can talk about Indiana Jones. You can talk about the original trilogy of Star Wars. You can even talk about the Godfather series of films. But here's the thing. I think there's a fatal flaw in all of those. For Indiana Jones, Temple of Doom, if you look at it through today's prism, it's not the greatest of films. It's a little too dark for me. It takes some of the fun out of Indiana Jones, in my personal opinion. Godfather 1 and 2, you can't argue that they are near perfect films. You cannot argue that. But 3 takes a big nosedive off a cliff for me. Sofia Coppola, great director, actress, perhaps not. Then when I look at the Star Wars original trilogy, and this might be a sin for me to even say as a pop culture enthusiast, it's just, for me, there's some parts that are rather dull, in my opinion, of the original trilogy. There's some real dull parts. Back to the Future is one cohesive story that was thought out, planned out, and done everything with purpose. If you look at Back to the Future Part 1, when you want to talk about near perfect films, everything that's in that movie pays off. There's no plot holes. There's no, why did they introduce this character and nothing ever happened? There's none of that. It's a complete story. And then when they did the sequels, they found a way to make them equally enjoyable, still give us, because Robert Zemeckis, who directed the 3 films and created and wrote them with Bob Gale, he said that in a sequel, people want to see the same movie that they liked, just in a different way. And I think that Back to the Future does the most effective job of that in terms of sequels. They're giving you a similar movie, similar beats, in a new packaging, and they make it all that much more enthralling. And I don't think that there's a significant drop in quality from one film to another. Depending on the day, Back to the Future 3 might be my favorite, or 1 might be my favorite, or 2 could be my favorite. And it's completely always changing. That's not the same for any other trilogy. There's kind of a definitive, this is the best. Empire Strikes Back is the best. Last Crusade is the best. Godfather Part 2 is the best, right? I mean, those are kind of, at least in my estimation, those are all kind of the ones that people go for. If you look at the Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy, Dark Knight, the best, Dark Knight Rises, it is what it is, right? So there's not a significant drop-off in entertainment value, in quality, in acting performances. Actually, I think the acting increases in quality film over film for Back to the Future, especially in regards to Tom Wilson. So just for all of those reasons, I think that it's the most complete, enjoyable, pure trilogy, because also Star Wars has 12 films now.
Right.
Indiana Jones has 4 films. I mean, there's not really any pure trilogies remaining, unless you count this most recent Ghostbusters one, because then that's an interesting conversation to have. But there's no pure trilogy out there that I think is better than Back to the Future for those reasons and more.
Brad, it is tradition here to accompany the conversation with a special brew. Today we have Voodoo Ranger 1985 Hazy IPA from New Belgium Brewing of Fort Collins, Colorado. Like totally loaded with juicy mango flavor, 1985 takes you back to the future of hazy IPAs. Now, there was a number of great movies in 1985, including The Breakfast Club, The Goonies, Rambo First Blood Part 2, Rocky IV, and Beverly Hills Cop. But the number one movie of that year was the legendary Back to the Future. So Voodoo Ranger 1985 is the perfect complement for our discussion today. Remember, the best way to enjoy an episode is with one of our featured brews. I would also like to ask you to subscribe to the podcast. And if you liked our talk today, please share this episode with a friend. All of the directories have an easy-to-use sharing function. And finally, to the legion of listeners from 75 countries and thousands of cities across the globe, I have to say thank you. And now, I raise my Voodoo Ranger 1985 Hazy IPA very high. And to all those slackers out there who stood up to their very own version of Mr. Strickland, I say cheers. For that first Back to the Future, and you mentioned Ghostbusters, I think those two movies, because I'm a child of the 80s, like we mentioned, and there are movies that if it's on, I'll definitely tune in. Or if I see it on Netflix, I'll click it on. So Stripes, for example. I love Stripes, but I love the first half. I hate the second half. I don't even watch the second half. But I enjoy watching the first half. For Spies Like Us, similar. I like the first half, not a fan of the second half. But you can watch Back to the Future all the way through, as you mentioned. There's no holes. It's almost perfect. Ghostbusters is similar in that fashion for me, the first one, in that it doesn't have a lot of holes either. So I think you're exactly right about that. The thing about the Star Wars trilogy, if you want to call it that was original trilogy, is different than most, is the second film being the best.
Yes.
And that's the one difference, I would say. But otherwise, I don't disagree. I think you're just about right.
See, that's why we get along, Robert.
That's right. So the writers of Back to the Future, Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale, they knew each other going back to USC. They also knew Steven Spielberg, but their first few films are not very solid. I mean, a true fan might enjoy them, but if you look back at that, what changes the dynamic for them? They try 1941, I think, Used Cars, but something has to change that dynamic to even give them an opportunity to make something like Back to the Future.
Well, I think that one, obviously their writing is solid. Even if the films aren't the best, there's been a ton of films made where the writing is great, just the execution of the writing didn't work out by the actors or by the director's vision, or the editing didn't come together. Whatever the reason was, the movie fell apart, just didn't connect with audiences. I think that the Bobs have always been strong in their writing. Even if you go back to a movie that they wrote in college called Bordello of Blood, that was later on actually made into a short film. They wrote on Kolchak the Night Stalker, which was a favorite of my father. My dad loved Kolchak the Night Stalker. So their writing was always solid. I think that sometimes it's just execution, and those films didn't connect the same way that maybe fans wanted to. And also, you look at those movies coming out after Jaws or Close Encounters of the Third Kind, it's going to be hard to come up with something that's going to top that. I actually think that's why Steven Spielberg, especially for 1941, went in the direction that he did. He's like, I got to do something different. So let's do a war era slapstick kind of comedy. But what changed for Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale was this. It was a film called Romancing the Stone. And I know that you probably are familiar with this movie.
Love it, actually.
It's another great one. Another great one. Michael Douglas, of course, starring. And Robert Zemeckis had the opportunity to direct that film. That movie came out. It was a hit. Everybody loved it. A sequel was, already being thought about, which was Jewel of the Nile, which Robert Zemeckis didn't direct and wasn't a strong follow-up to its predecessor. But anyway, it was a financial success. As you may know, when you get a financial success in Hollywood, all of a sudden, bad ideas to studio executives start sounding like really good ideas. And all these people who originally turned down the idea of Back to the Future were all of a sudden that much more receptive to it. And originally, Steven Spielberg wanted to make it and produce it under Amblin. But the Bob said, we want to do something that isn't connected to you. No disrespect, Steven Spielberg. We want to kind of stand on our own feet. We don't want to be the guys who just get movies made because they're best friends with Steven Spielberg. So they shopped it around prior to Romancing the Stone, and they kind of got turned down by everybody. And I talk about it in the book. At one point, everyone said, take it to Disney. And then they take it to Disney. And Disney's like, are you out of your mind? We're not going to have an incestuous movie where a mother falls in love with her son. Like, that's not a Walt Disney Company idea. So after Romancing the Stone comes out, all of a sudden, the studios are more receptive to it. Originally, Frank Price, who was the head of Columbia Pictures, moved over to Universal. And he was the one who believed in the Bobs, and he wanted to have a hand in the movie. And after that, the Bobs were like, well, everybody wants to make it now. Let's go back to the guy who originally believed in the story, Steven Spielberg. So the turning point for them was Romancing the Stone being a financial success. If Robert Zemeckis went out there, directed Romancing the Stone, and it made a puddle in the box office instead of a big splash, we wouldn't have ever had a Back to the Future.
Yeah, and I do love Romancing the Stone. That's one of those movies I do the same thing. If it comes on, if I see it on Netflix, I tune in. I think it's just a great movie. The synergy between Kathleen Turner and Michael Douglas is great. So I absolutely love that movie. And I know you've told this story many times, and it's in your book as well. But how did the concept of Back to the Future develop initially? I think it was Bob Gale.
Yeah, Bob Gale went back home, and he was in his parents' basement and going through old things, found some of his old yearbooks, and then he found his father's old yearbook. And before this, there were already, he being Bob Gale and Robert Zemeckis, were already thinking about, man, wouldn't a time travel story be fun? But they couldn't figure out how to get into it. So fast forward to he's in the basement for his parents, and he finds his dad's yearbook, and his dad was the president of his graduating class, and they went to the same high school. And Bob Gale was thinking, man, I know the guy who was the president of my graduating class, and I didn't want to have anything to do with that guy at all. He was a total jerk. And then the idea came to him of, I wonder if I would have been friends with my parents if we went to high school together, which really is a fantastic idea.
Fantastic, yeah.
Of, man, would we have been friends? And then it was from that thought that he calls Bob Zemeckis or has a meeting with him later on and says, I think I know how we can get into this story. What if somebody goes back in time and has to go to high school with his parents and figures out that his dad's a total nerd, his mom's, for lack of a better term, promiscuous, and he has to, see his parents at his same age, because it doesn't matter if you're 15 or 50, you never quite can conceptualize that your parents were once your age and they went through the same things that you did. They had to have their first kiss or their first car, or ask out their first date or their first heartbreak or whatever. You don't think about that. And so it was a really interesting way to get into a time travel story that isn't the H.G. Wells variety, where it's kind of this big, huge, massive undertaking. It's a very small, contained story that doesn't get bigger than a fictional town. And really, not even a fictional town. It doesn't get bigger than the cross section of really one or two families, three families at the most. So I think that's where Bob Gale came up with the idea, and from there they were off to the races.
Yeah, I think that that's the magic of the film, to keep it that small, because when things are that small, it actually makes it much larger for the individual. I'll give you an example. So I watched all of the True Blood. I went through all of the entirety of the True Blood. Me and my wife enjoyed that. But the beginning, when you only have that one location and a few characters, it seems larger and more important. When they try to make it national, international, it loses all of its luster. I think you're exactly right about that.
Now, sometimes that can work, right? Like, if I think about the Fast and Furious films, the first two are kind of like real small stories, right? But as they progress, they get larger and larger. Now, they've gotten to the point of ridiculousness, but I think that somewhere around that Fast Five, where they really went big and The Rock comes into play, they hit a stride. So bigger in that perspective worked. But for this time travel story, or for True Blood, or for any of those, these smaller, I don't want to say smaller stakes, but these smaller stories to where they're about a guy trying to make his parents fall in love, as opposed to an Avenger trying to save the world from Thanos. I think that that was the right route to go for Back to the Future.
Another aspect of the film, because you can have a great story, but if you don't have the right cast or even the right setting, it may not come off or may not be a success. The casting is absolutely perfect, I think, for Back to the Future. But we have to talk about the original casting for Marty Mcfly, which is the most important character in the trilogy. And it was originally Eric Stoltz. Can you talk about that a little bit? I know that's something you probably went into in depth in your podcast.
Sure.
But the story of casting Eric Stoltz and then how it eventually gets to Michael J. Fox.
Originally, Michael J. Fox was always their first choice. Michael J. Fox was on Family Ties as Alex P. Keaton, everyone's favorite teenage conservative and Reagan admirer. And that was the first choice. Gary Goldberg was the producer of that show. And, the filmmakers went to Gary Goldberg, said, we'd love to have Michael. They said, hey, Michael's not available. He's doing Family Ties. I'm not going to let him out. So it's like, okay, next. And they had a laundry list of people who came in and auditioned. Even Ben Stiller was on that list. C. Thomas Howell was in the running for a long time. And they settled on Eric Stoltz. Eric Stoltz did Mask and was a very good actor. He was an actor. He wasn't a comedian. He wasn't a sketch comic. He wasn't a teenage heartthrob in the traditional sense of the term. He was an actor, and a quality one. So they cast him. They said, we think he can pull this off. And mind you, they had a mandate to make this movie by a certain date. If they didn't get the movie done by a certain date, they were going to cancel the film. The studio was, which is kind of crazy when you think about it today, that you're going to invest all this money and just throw it out the window. But that was the mandate that they got from the studio. So under the gun, they said, he'll work. And we're going to surround him by a great cast. Crispin Glover as George McFly, Leah Thompson as Lorraine. We're going to have Thomas F. Wilson as Biff. We're going to have Christopher Lloyd as Dr. Brown. It's going to go great. So they shoot this movie, Robert, for 6 weeks, which is quite a long time. By those days' standards, that's when you're getting to
halfway through,
if not almost there, right? This is 6 weeks of shooting. This isn't pre-production or post-production. This is just the shooting part of the movie. And they're going through dailies, and Robert Zemeckis had that feeling in the pit of his stomach of, oh man, this isn't working. I think we made a mistake, right? Because in these films, you really only get one shot to get it right. You only get one shot. And they just realized that Eric Stoltz was playing the character as if he was really in this situation, which is what an actor should do to a large extent, right?
Absolutely.
Play it like you're there. And Eric Stoltz even took kind of the method actor approach, where he was having people refer to him as Marty on set. He was being kind of extra physical in scenes with Tom Wilson, who Tom Wilson went on the record and talked about how, he got shoved a couple hard times from Marty, but he was playing it more serious, a little bit darker, a little bit more like, my mom is actually in love with me. I'm actually not going to be born.
Right. Yeah, right. I'm seriously scared out of my mind.
I'm stuck in 1955. And they just think that the comedy that the Bobs had written in there wasn't connecting. And they invited Steven Spielberg over. Spielberg looked at the dailies and said, yeah, it's just not there. He's just not hitting the beats. And so they had to make this decision to fire Eric Stoltz, let him go, and recast, or else the movie just wouldn't have worked for another reason. Which by it, like today, if you are casting, I don't know, Ocean's 11, and George Clooney's attached and Brad Pitt's attached, and you film for 6 weeks, and then you're like, Clooney's really not doing it for me. Like, I need Leo DiCaprio in this role. The studio's going to say, hey, too bad.
Right.
You went with George Clooney. You're sticking with George Clooney. Thankfully, Frank Price and the people over there at Universal said, okay. And Sid Sheinberg, who had a big influence on the film, who had a massive influence on the film in many ways, Sid Sheinberg did. They said, okay, we'll let you recast. So there's only one name on that list, and it was Michael J. Fox. And they went back to Gary Goldberg, and Gary Goldberg said, okay, look, I'll let him do this. One, if he likes the script. If he likes the script and wants to do it, I will let him do it under the condition that family ties must come first, no matter what. And so they went to Michael J. Fox, or Gary Goldberg did, and he had like a manila envelope with the script in it and said, hey, there's this new movie, Back to the Future. They want you for it. I want you to read this. And if you like it, I'm going to let you do it, but you have to shoot family ties first. You're going to have to work, off the clock on this. So he hands it to Michael J. Fox. Michael J. Fox puts it back down on Gary's desk and says, best thing I've ever read. And he said, I'll do it. Without ever reading the script, Michael J. Fox is like, I'm in. Let me do this movie. And so he does it. And that's how they ended up getting Michael J. Fox in the film after casting Eric Stoltz originally.
The thing that I like about Michael J. Fox for that character, Marty McFly, is he has an energy. He has comedic timing, which apparently Eric Stoltz did not have. I hadn't seen any of the footage of him being Marty McFly, but he certainly has the comedic timing. And most importantly for me, he has confidence. In that character, if Marty McFly doesn't have confidence, the whole thing doesn't work, because the purpose of it is George McFly has no confidence. And that's the reason why his mother, Lorraine, falls in love with him, is that confidence. He can exude that confidence, maybe from his character, from Family Ties. But I think that is the element that's important for Michael J. Fox and Marty McFly to make that character what it was.
I think that, and he's also written as a reactionary character. He's reacting to everything that's going on. And Michael J. Fox reacted with the comedy. And you got to think, he's coming off of a sitcom, the number one sitcom in the nation. He knows how to play for comedy. And I actually think if you look at his performance, Michael J. Fox almost knows when to pause for a laugh, as if an audience was there in the taping, like he's used to. He honed that ability. And he knows, hey, if this was a sitcom, this is where the laugh is. Let me sell the laugh. And he does such a sensational job over it. And he makes it enjoyable to watch him go through the chaos that he's going through. It's entertaining. It's not, it's not anxiety filled, which is, from what I've seen, which is very little, and mainly what I've heard anecdotally from others about Eric Stoltz's performance, which it was almost a little bit like it put you on pins and needles watching him, because you're like, oh my God, his mom's about to kill, as instead of the way that Michael J. Fox's Marty reacts to waking up in Lorraine's bed in 1955. It's a perfect reaction. You're my ma, but you're so, you're so.
She was, though.
Young. Young. You're young.
Yes, young.
But, that was such a great reaction. So I think it was just the way that two different actors approached the same part. And it doesn't mean that Eric Stoltz wasn't a great actor or isn't a great actor. Just wasn't the role for him.
The other thing about the film I love, and I'll mention a few things about the following two films also, but the locations and the setting, I love the opening scene. It's awesome. I love the clocks and the whole opening scene. I love the house. You mentioned it being small and about family and so forth. It seems to be perfect. That house seems to be absolutely perfect. I like the town square, even though that's fabricated from, a Universal lot. And even the mall in the 1980s, it reminded you of a 1980s mall. I just love the setting. I think that adds to the film also. The
setting does add to the film, and it adds to the film in this way. One, like you said, it's small. You feel like it's a lived-in town. You feel like people would know one another within it. But the other thing is they do a great shot of showing you the mall, Doc's garage, Marty's house, the town square, which is paramount to me for the success of this film, because when you see that 1985 town square, and then you go back to 1955, it feels like the same place, but it does feel like from a different time. And one of the things the filmmakers did so well is they said you can show great passage of time through logos. And you see a lot of, whether it's the Texaco logo from the gas station or different things throughout the film, you really do get a sense of, oh yeah, times have changed in this town based upon the iconography that we're used to for 1985. Look at what it looked like in 1955. Let's have 16 tons as a 45 single that somebody can buy from Tennessee Ernie Ford. Let's have the Ronald Reagan movie on the billboard to really set this time. But I think that the setting of the film was perfect. I love the name Hill Valley. The only thing that's ever bothered me is they're so close to Halloween. and there's no Halloween decorations.
Oh.
It's late October. Where are the Halloween decorations, Bobs? I don't know. But I guess that would have put the film in a certain time frame.
Now you can watch it any time of the year and it holds up no matter what.
Right. So I'm sure that's why they did that. But it's always stuck out to me. I'm like, wow, I guess Hill Valley isn't a very big fan of Halloween.
I got to talk about the DeLorean. I actually did a podcast with a man who wrote a book on John DeLorean. He's a fascinating character. Originally, it was supposed to be a refrigerator, and then, of course, they go to the DeLorean, and I think it's because the cost of the film, actually, they had this huge ending plan where there's going to be this atomic testing site in a refrigerator, and it just didn't add up, and it just seemed to make more sense. And of course, it's perfect for the film. It's another one of those decisions that turns out to be an excellent decision.
So the ending of the movie was going to be, so the time machine was going to be a refrigerator. And the end of the movie was Doc was going to put this refrigerator on the back of his truck, and Marty's going to get in it, and they're going to drive to a nuclear test site and then hope the hell it works, right? In the lead-lined fridge. And that concept was dropped only for cost. Only for cost. No other reason. Not because of story beats, not because, wouldn't it be better than this? But out of that, and I think this is where great art comes from constraints. If somebody says, here's a blank checkbook, Robert, go out and do whatever the hell you want to do, you're not going to have the same kind of story because you have you have limitless ideas, and no idea is too big. You can do whatever you want. When the studio says, hey, no, that costs too much money, you're going to have to figure some way around that. That's what challenges the artist. That's what challenges the creativity. And that's what made Bob Gale and Bob Zemeckis go, hey, wouldn't it make more sense if this time machine was like in motion? Because, you're going to have to accelerate it in some way to get it to go back to the past or back to the future or whatever, when it makes sense on wheels. And then as soon as they made that decision, it's like, okay, what kind of car should it be? And the most futuristic looking vehicle, even by today's standards, it's like a retro futuristic look, but a futuristic look nonetheless, was the DeLorean. And that's why they made the idea to put it that stainless steel structure. And they kind of explained the science of why he chose a DeLorean.
Right. Yeah.
And he even said, hey, the way I see it, if you're going to build a time machine into a car, why not do it with some style?
Perfect line.
And that's what they did. And I think the DeLorean, as far as movie cars go, we can debate the Batmobile. You can talk about Herbie. You can talk about Kit. You can talk about the Aston Martin of Sean Connery and James Bond. You can talk about all those. And they're all iconic for their own reasons. I don't think that there's a movie car more iconic than that one right there. I'm pointing at a poster behind me for your podcast listeners. And I'll tell you this. A few years ago, 2015 happened, and I saw a story on Good Morning America about they're redoing the DeLorean. They're going to put out new versions of the DeLorean, refurbished versions, right? The DeLorean Motor Company was. And I didn't even know the DeLorean Motor Company was still in existence.
I didn't either.
I had no idea, right? And so I being the Back to the Future fan, hosting the podcast that I said, let me look into this, and maybe I can talk to somebody at DeLorean and have them on the podcast. So I reach out online. Turns out the DeLorean Motor Company, based in Houston, Texas. Well, that's where I live.
Fortuitous.
So I got a call from a man named Stephen Wynn, who's the owner of the company now, who's from Liverpool, England, but lives in Houston, Texas, and said, hey, come on down to the headquarters and I'll show you around the manufacturing. I'll show you the DeLoreans. I'll do all this. So I remember getting in my car. It was like a 30-minute drive, and I pull up and there's just a line of DeLoreans, right? One after another, after another, after another. And then I walk into the showroom floor and there's a time machine, a perfect replica of the DeLorean time machine. And we did the tour, and at the end he goes, you want to get inside of it?
Absolutely.
So, I've been waiting all my life. We had a camera there, and I got to look into the camera and say, time circuit's on, pull the little lever, and all the lights come on. And it was just one of the best moments of my life. But yeah, the DeLorean, you couldn't have picked a better car. And at one point, Ford came to him and said, we want this to be a Mustang. Like, we'll pay for it to be a Mustang. And Bob Gale, I won't quote him directly, but he famously said, Doc Brown doesn't drive an effing Mustang. And that was his response to that. So there you have it. The DeLorean was meant to be.
Wait a minute, Doc. Are you telling me that you built a time machine out of a DeLorean?
The way I see it, If you're gonna build a time machine into a car, why not do it with some style?
Can I be critical at all? Because I know that you're a true fan.
You can be. It doesn't mean that I will agree with your criticism, but we can talk about it.
Sure. Yes, absolutely. It's actually in the second one.
Okay.
And it's at the beginning of the movie. I think, and I don't really understand it. I don't know Bob Zemeckis' work like you do, but I'll ask the question and I'll let you decide, or I'll explain what my criticism is. Anytime that you try to determine what the future is going to be like, you're going to fail. Mm-hmm. For example, in Back to the Future 2, the car's flying, but they have TV screens as if it were 1990, and cars are flying around. Or when he gets fired, it's printed out on a very old printer. It doesn't hold up to the test of time. Sure. That's my problem with it. I also think it's a little corny. But what I'm really kind of surprised at is that Robert Zemeckis would even do that. It just seems out of character for me to think that Robert Zemeckis would take that chance knowing that he's going to fail in that regard. He's not going to be able to accurately predict the future. Now, I think Back to the Future 2 for me is better when it goes back to 85 and then back to 55. And then I think it finds its footing and it's a great movie at that point. And I know they have to go to the future. I know that's it's a central part of the story. I'm just not a big fan of that set or the way it's portrayed, I guess.
I can understand where you're coming from. First off, if you have a movie or you have a series of movies about time travel and you only go back, it's like, okay, we've seen this. Like, what does the future look like? Because everybody, or for most people, when I ask them, if you had a time machine, what would you do? Would you go forward or backward? Most people say, I want to go forward. I want to see what happens in 100 years or whatever. So you had to go into the future. And they knew they weren't going to get anything right. If I were to ask you right now, Robert, what is your smartphone going to look like in 30 years?
Right.
We can't. We have no idea. And we can sketch something out of what we might think could happen and what have you. But I think that future scene, the 2015 that was portrayed in Back to the Future, I don't think that it was ever meant to be, this is exactly what we feel like the future is going to look like. It was like, let's have a little bit of fun with this. We know we're going to get 99% of this wrong, but we need to go to the future and see, at least play around with it. There were things that they predicted that did come true. Paying for things with your thumbprint later on happened with the iPhone and Apple Pay, picture-in-picture screens. I wrote about some of it in the book, but if you actually go back and look, there were several things.
The Cubs?
Yes, the Cubs. The Cubs. Come on, man. That was a huge one. There were a few things, if you go back and look at, that they did get right. But I think that they knew at the time, and you knew 10 years before and 20 years before, these weren't going to be accurate. But I think that if you never went to the future in a time travel series called Back to the Future, you would be leaving a lot on the table. And so I understand the criticism. Sure. I get that. And do I agree that I have more fun in the movies, in that movie, when they go to 1985, the alternate 1985 and back into the first film, which I think is a genius idea? Absolutely. However, you had to have that future part. And it gave us, Back to the Future 2 gave us some of the most iconic pieces of memorabilia, whether it be the hoverboard or Pepsi Perfect or the almanac. Some of those things, if you didn't go to that 2015 era, you wouldn't have had those.
The other thing that, and maybe you can square this for me, I didn't quite understand it.
Right.
In the first film, it seems like there's only one universe or future universe. There's not a multiverse. Mm-hmm. And so in the future, whatever happens to you would affect your past, or from the past would affect your future. That's why when he's playing up on the stage and his hand's fading away or the pictures are fading. So there's only one real future. Mm-hmm. But in the second one, they create a multiverse. How do they square that one? Because that's another one I'm like, okay, well, there used to be one universe, but now they have two universes. So is it the multiverse or is it the one future universe?
So this is something that I have thought about. And when you get into time travel and it's all theoretical, there's no one way to do it. It is kind of, your mind can go crazy trying to figure it all out. From what I think is this, is if something goes wrong in the past, it alters the future. But where this multiverse came into play was they went to the future and changed something, right? They changed something in the future. And then it had this ripple effect. So somebody from the future went back to the past, gave them future information, which then set on this tangential timeline. Because we do know, even in the first movie, if you do something in the past, it's going to alter the future, right, in a different way. Whether that be running over old man Peabody's pine tree, and now the mall is called Lone Pine Mall instead of Twin Pine Mall, or anything like that. We know whatever you do in the past is going to affect the future. That's why at the end of Back to the Future 1, he doesn't return to the same exact reality, right? The biggest change from 1985 at the beginning of the movie to the end of the movie in Back to the Future 1 was George McFly successful, mom's thin, brother has a job.
Right.
I don't know if Jailbird Joey's still a jailbird. I'm not sure. I don't think that he is.
We'll assume he's not. Yeah.
We'll assume that he's not. We'll assume the cake is not made for him. And Marty's sister has all these, boyfriends. Oh, she can't keep up with them, right? So that changed because George stood up to Biff. And then Biff we see as subservient. So I think that, is there a multiverse? I think that there almost has to be, because at some points there's two Martys or two Biffs or two Docs all in the same time period. But I think that they try their best to make it easy to follow. Because I know Marvel's about to get into the multiverse, especially with this Spider-Man film that's coming out soon.
Looks awesome.
It looks awesome. I agree. But Back to the Future tries its best to be a linear, like we can figure out, okay, he did this in the past, so now that means this is going to happen in the future and vice versa. But there is, if you go down the rabbit hole on YouTube, you'll hear a lot about a Marty A and a Marty B and a Marty C. And how could Marty C be here with Marty A? And you just get confused. So I try not to dive too much into it. But I think to answer your question, the future all went back to the past and then altered it. So that changed the time.
And I don't like to get into that type of criticism, because to me, it's just about entertainment. You're supposed to have fun. So I don't really get into it. But that was just one aspect of it, especially with Marvel going into the multiverse and so forth.
Okay, relax, Doc. It's me. It's Marty.
Oh, it can't be. Just sent you back to the future.
Oh, I know you did send me back to the future, but I'm back. I'm back from the future.
Great Scott.
What I would like to do now, if it's okay, and I'm sure you've done this 100 times, if we would recast it today, and I have a few which I just kind of thought about. I'm like, you know what? I think it would be fun, and I know you've done this exercise as well. Could I run my suggestions?
Let's hear it.
And
I'm excited.
You can let me know what you think.
By the way, the Back to the Future community hates whenever I do this, because I like to play recasting couch all the time for today's standards. I think it's just fun to do.
Well, I apologize to them right off the bat.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I love it. I love talking about this stuff. So go ahead. Give me your recast.
Okay, so my Marty McFly is Tom Holland.
I agree.
Now, I've given some thought to age. So if someone has to be older at some point and younger at another point, they have to be almost older now but kind of look younger. So I've given some thought to that. Doc Brown, I had Ken Jeong, and then I was thinking Jim Carrey, but I settled on Bryan Cranston.
Cranston's not a bad pick. That's not a bad pick. Jim Carrey's not a bad pick either.
I just think he's got some comedic timing. I did really like the idea of Ken Jeong because it would be a completely different type of character. For Lorraine McFly, I had a few. I thought Elizabeth Olsen, Anna Kendrick, but I settled on Margot Robbie just because my view of who George McFly is factored into it. So Margot Robbie is who I settled on.
Okay, Margot.
I think Anna Kendrick, if you dressed her up in the 50s, should be perfect. She has that. She could pull that off. Same thing for Elizabeth Olsen, but she had just done it in her recent Marvel venture. So I went with Margot Robbie. So George McFly, I went with Mikey Day from SNL.
Yeah. I had Mikey on the podcast.
Okay. So really it was because I really like the SNL skit with Mikey Day and Margot Robbie, and I think it's really funny. I just thought it kind of made sense it would play if you had Margot Robbie with Mikey Day, but I could go with Anna Kendrick.
Mikey Day is a massive Back to the Future fan.
Oh, really?
So I'm sure he's pleased to hear that. Oh, massive. I had him on Back to the Future, the podcast. We talked about his love for it and his awkward run-in with Steven Spielberg. So yeah, he's big fan.
Well, on SNL, I know he can play that type of character. He can play like a dorky type of character, but I think he could also pull off a confident George McFly. So that's why I thought he'd be a good choice. So what do you think so far? Am I tracking okay?
I like them. Tom Holland, I'm 100% in on. I'm 100% in on. My Doc Brown is different from yours. My Doc Brown is much different. I went with a guy who's originally considered for Doc Brown, Eddie Murphy.
Wow. Well, he's great, so he could pull it off. You know that.
I think he'd pull it off. I think it'd be a different mix.
So this is going to get into the wrestling sphere here. My Biff Tannen, I said The Miz.
Okay, yeah, I can see that.
I was thinking Cody Rhodes too, but actually it's one of those two.
Yeah, I could see Miz. Miz is definitely, he knows how to be unlikable.
Sure. Right. And Biff is, I don't want to take anything away from the original casting because he did such an awesome job of that character through all of its iterations.
Yes.
Through him being older, going back to the West, all of it was fantastic.
I did some count, and I think it's either 7. I can't remember exactly what the count is. I think it's 7 different variations of Biff.
Wow. I mean, fantastic.
Yeah.
My Jennifer Parker, I went with Haley Steinfeld just because I think she's a superstar, just about ready to break out into she's a star now, but superstardom.
I had her on my list as Leah Thompson's character, as Lorraine, but continue.
She would have been great for that. She would have been great. So then I just have a few others. I thought that the scene where Marty McFly goes into and he meets his mother. So I thought, okay, I got to cast his grandparents. I got to cast the Baines. So I said, originally I thought maybe Eugene Levy, but he was a little too old. So I settled with Ben Stiller because I knew that he did actually audition for Marty McFly. So I thought, you got to go with Ben Stiller. And then for Stella Baines, I went with Elizabeth Shue because she was in the original. So and plus, I had a huge crush on Elizabeth Shue.
Hey, by the way, I think Elizabeth Shue looks better now than she even did back then.
She's awesome.
I think she's stunning.
And then the last thing I have is the soundtrack. Even though, there was different groups, it's generally associated with Huey Lewis and the News. So if I were to recast the music, I said Maroon 5.
Okay. You know what? Your list isn't bad.
Adam Levine could pull off, the professor type of.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm just afraid you're too darn loud. I think that's a good list. I'm actually impressed by some of these pulls. I didn't even think about recasting the musician for the film. Yeah, Maroon 5 could pull it off. That's good. I like this list. I approve.
So it's not bad?
I approve.
What's your main group then? What would be your number one recasting A-list?
I've thought about it before. So I'm trying to remember my list from the podcast that we did, but it was Tom Holland. It was Eddie Murphy. Now, my backup was Robert Downey Jr.
I thought about him.
Because of their chemistry they had in Iron Man and Spider-Man.
I did think about him.
That was a backup, but I like Eddie Murphy. I just think I think he'd do something different. I think Robert Downey Jr. would give us Robert Downey Jr.
Yeah.
As Doc. You know what I mean? It'd be like Tony Stark.
Yes.
I had Haley Steinfeld for Leah Thompson's character for Lorraine. I had from Star Wars, from the sequel trilogy for Biff.
That was a challenge.
John Boyega.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. I thought he could pull it off.
He's fantastic. He could.
He is good. I just liked I liked the idea of him. For George, I don't remember who I cast for George. I could look it up, but I like Mikey. Crispin's such a strong actor and left such a...
Oh, amazing.
I actually think more than any other character, he had the most difficult to replicate performance.
Oh, absolutely. He's completely unique.
Jeff Wiseman, who did George in 2 and 3 in a more limited capacity, did what he could, but Crispin is Crispin.
Right.
He's such a unique.
Completely unique. It's completely unique.
So unique. I got to talk to him. He was promoting a movie called Lucky Day, and I got to talk to him about, Back to the Future a little bit when we were on the phone with each other. He had this unique line delivery accompanied by these interesting physical movements.
Totally.
That I just thought it was just great. It was just great. So he's a hard one to recast. I think for Jennifer, it's got to be someone very pretty. Claudia Wells was beautiful. Elizabeth Shue, beautiful. You have to have someone pretty, but it also has to be young with some acting chops. There's an actress and a singer. Her name's Becky G. As who I went with for my Jennifer Parker. She acted in the Power Rangers movie and a couple other things. I went with her. And so that's what I have. That's what I have for my A list.
Well, thanks for doing that because I thought it was fun. I was interested in doing that.
Yeah, no problem.
Do you find that there's a lot of crossover fans between the Back to the Future fandom in that area and arena and pro wrestling?
I think, yes, there is. And I think that if you're a fan of pro wrestling, you're a fan of pop culture anyway. I don't think you can just be, because pro wrestling isn't a straight up sport. You're like, oh, like I like boxing, so I like wrestling. You know, I like wrestling, so I watch football. Sure, those cross sections come together, but wrestling is pop culture. Wrestling is comic books come to life. Wrestling is a fantastical story playing out in front of you. So there are definite people who cross over. Somebody who I do a show with, Booker T, he's a Back to the Future fan. CM Punk is a Back to the Future fan. And I'm sure I could go down the list and find many, many wrestlers who are Back to the Future fans. There's definitely a cross section for it. And I think it's because it's pop culture. Wrestling's pop culture. And it's a fantastical story. And that's what wrestling tries to be.
Well, Booker T is great.
Yes.
I mean, Booker T is one of the great wrestlers probably of all time.
I agree.
I can just tell you I've followed wrestling most of my life, generally not lately. And it's just because I'm into many different other things right now. I got all kinds of other things going on. Haven't been able to follow it. My son does, actually. He's a firefighter, but
oh, wow.
he loves wrestling and he follows it. I was thinking the other day, and I knew I was going to have you on. I'm like, okay, I'm going to tell him this. The first wrestler I ever remember, I live in Illinois, not too far from St. Louis. So the first two wrestlers I ever remember as a kid were Bulldog Bob Brown and Harley Race. Those were the first wrestlers as a kid I ever remembered, ever cheered for or against. In that sphere was Andre the Giant, but he wasn't in this area, I don't think, a lot. But I knew of him. So those were the first wrestlers I ever remember.
Harley Race, one of the greatest of all time, by far. That man, if we talk about in terms of wrestling, he knew what it meant to be a world champion. And he crafted really the prototype of what we think of when we think of what the responsibilities are of a world champion, more so behind the scenes and in the ring, how they're supposed to carry themselves, what they're supposed to do. Their role on the show is to really make other people and draw a house. And that's what Harley Race was able to do. I think that those are great. Harley Race is a great first impression on pro wrestling. You talk about a man's man, the late and great Harley Race. Absolutely.
And then I grew up in the 80s and then as a young guy in the early 90s. And so that's my basis for wrestling. So when I look or speak about wrestling, and I enjoy it, by the way, I love those storylines from the past. I think the two best storylines of my lifetime were the NWO. Mm-hmm. I love that storyline. And of course, Hulk Hogan's in the storyline as a heel, which is great. And then I love the dynamic between Stone Cold and Mr. McMahon. So those are the two best storylines of my life, in my opinion.
Well, I think, and this is somewhat of a controversial opinion, I guess, to some of the online wrestling community, because Vince McMahon is viewed in one way or another in today's standards. But I think Vince McMahon is the greatest wrestling heel of all time.
Perfect.
I think that he's one of the best promos of all time. I think that he's one of the best characters that company has ever produced. And there is nobody who is able to generate heat and be able to get somebody over more than a Vincent Kennedy McMahon. And this whole thing's his vision. He took wrestling from a small territorial industry to a national and then global behemoth with the WWF, then the WWE. And we wouldn't be talking about wrestling in the same terms that we are today if it wasn't for him. You'd be talking about Bulldog Bob Brown, and I'd be talking about, Gustavo Mendoza here in Houston in a more localized form, right? Vince took it from being local territories where there's local stars to international superstars. So his mark on the business, just as a promoter, is Hall of Fame legend status by itself. And then when he decided to become a performer, he was great. As a commentator, Vince McMahon is great.
Right.
Vince McMahon was a great play-by-play
Gorilla Monsoon, and yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, he was great. So, I think that Vince and Austin, that was a storyline that got me to be a wrestling fan. Steve Austin was the reason why I became a wrestling fan. And so I think that the two of them, they made magic together.
Can I do my Mount Rushmore?
I'd love to hear it.
It's based on my time period, obviously, when I watched wrestling and what I was influenced with. And I have to say Ric Flair, because he came to St. Louis, and I just remember him from that time period. I loved him being the heel. It's, the whole talk and the bravado. So I got Ric Flair. Hulk Hogan, I mean, he's not a technician or anything like that. But if it's about entertainment, I mean, he's a great babyface. I mean, he's almost the perfect babyface. And then I have Stone Cold Steve Austin, great talker and a really good wrestler. And then my final one, I wanted to say The Rock, but The Rock ventured out and got bigger than just the wrestling universe. So I have to say Taker. So those are my Mount Rushmore of wrestling.
We're close. I have Ric Flair, and this changes every other week. But I have Ric Flair. I have The Undertaker. I have both of those. And those are the only other two names I have in common with you. From there, I go Dwayne The Rock Johnson. And finally, I go with the Macho Man, Randy Savage. Ooh, yeah.
That's really good.
Thank you. I think that if you look at all the qualifications of what makes a classic great pro wrestler, you think about character, you think about entrance, you think about attire, you think about in-ring work, you think about promo ability, you think about a great finishing move. Randy Savage checks every one of those boxes. Over-the-top character, colorful appearance, great entrance, great finishing move with the elbow off the top rope, catchphrases, could work with anybody, could work with a broomstick. And I think that he is, in my estimation, the perfect pro wrestler, Macho Man Randy Savage.
The only thing I would say about Hogan, obviously in the ring, he's not as good. His finish is not good at all. But the entrance, it still gives me chills thinking as a young kid of that entrance. And then later, when he was the heel in NWO, it was exactly the same thing. It just gives you those types of chills. I don't think you could replicate that type of entrance.
No. When Real American plays, to this day, I was at WrestleMania 35, he came out. That song, he's classic. He's iconic.
I'd like to finish with sharing a story with you. And there's a connection to wrestling. And there's kind of an unsolved mystery that I would like to solve. When I was in college, and I'd never been able to track this guy down, he came to college. He was one of those guys who was older, and so the rest of us are all 21, 22 years old, and he was one of those older people that went back to school. He had been a professional wrestler, he said. His name was Shamrock Sean. I never heard of this guy. I tried to find his name. I'm sure that, obviously Sean probably wasn't even his real name, but he came to college, and he was there for a semester. And he would do these interesting things. We'd go to the bar, and now this guy was probably in his 40s at this point. And so it was interesting that he was partying with us anyway, but he would take a stack of money and he would put it on the bar. And that was before we had, people would use credit cards and stuff like that. And if somebody wanted to drink, the bartender would just pull it out of that stack. And when that stack was gone, he'd just get up and leave. The thing that I remember about it, I wish I could find this guy who he actually was. I'm sure he was just one of these workers who went around to these different locations, never made it big.
Yeah.
When he left college, and generally these older students talk more in class. I don't know if when you went to college, that's what happens, but
yeah.
And he was talking, and this girl turns around, and we were in these like individual desks, and he barely fit in this desk. This guy was a huge man. And the girl turns around and says, "We are tired of hearing you effing talk." And he stood up, body slammed the desk, and walked out of the classroom. Never saw him again. And I wish I knew who that person was. But he said he went by Shamrock Sean.
Somebody out there knows who he is, but wow.
Isn't that a crazy story?
Wrestlers are a different bunch. I'll tell you that.
Yes.
I'll tell you, they're cut a little bit different.
Well, thanks for deviating off into wrestling. I just have one more question, and it's back to the Future universe. And I know there were some books and some games. Does Back to the Future, has it built the canon similar to Star Wars? Are there things that are taken as truth that come from the books, maybe from the games, and of course from the movies?
Yeah. I mean, generally, canon is accepted for not so much for the animated series as much as the video game, the Telltale video game that came out, which was directly worked on by Bob Gale and had the original cast, a lot of the original cast back to voice their characters, including Michael J. Fox. They had a cameo as Marty McFly toward the end of the game, and Christopher Lloyd played Doc Brown. Those are accepted, and the comic books that were also written by Bob Gale. IDW comic books that came out, started in 2015. They're written by Bob Gale. So if it's written by Bob Gale and it has Back to the Future on it, we generally accept it as canon, part of the story, as well as Back to the Future. The ride is in that vernacular as well, in that same universe of Back to the Future. There hasn't been any more expanded stories other than those. There's, Star Wars has novels and video games, and comic books and TV shows and all kinds of stuff. There hasn't been many of those for Back to the Future because Bob and Bob are so protective of the franchise. They're so protective of Back to the Future, the property, that they don't expose them as much. Now, this isn't an expansion of the story, but there's the musical that's out now in Europe that's hopefully going to come stateside here in the next year or so. There are those, but there's nothing more than that.
You think there's an opportunity for a Back to the Future 4? I know that Bob Gale specifically has said that he didn't want to bastardize the work that had been done already just as a cash grab, which happens in movies. Do you think that's a possibility?
I don't think it's a current possibility, just based upon what the Bob and Bob say. I mean, they both say over my dead body. Will there be another Back to the Future movie? Most Back to the Future fans say, don't touch this franchise. I don't want you messing with Back to the Future. I'm not one of those guys. I actually write about it in the book, and I had this thought yesterday. But in the book, I talk about I was one of those people who don't touch my franchise. I like it the way it is. And then I went and saw the 2016 Ghostbusters Answer the Call, and I hated it. I did not like that movie. It had nothing to do with the female cast or anything like that. I thought that they all did a great job with the material they were given. I just didn't think the movie connected to me. It just didn't feel like a Ghostbusters film in the ways that 1 and 2 did. But when I went home, I watched Ghostbusters 1984 the same day. And I thought that maybe my love for the films would decrease a little bit. But they didn't. I still love Ghostbusters 1 and 2 just as much as I did before that movie came out in 2016. So with that being the premise, I said, they can make a Back to the Future film. And if they make a 4, they make a reboot or they recast it or whatever, and I love it, great. That's another Back to the Future movie I can talk about and love for decades to come. If they make it and it's awful, well, I still have the 3 movies.
Right, yeah.
And that's not going to change my love for them. So, hey, they took a swing and they missed. So I'm all for Back to the Future getting another film. I think that the Ghostbusters Afterlife really breathed some life into that concept for me because I thought that they handled a perfect balance of introducing new characters, furthering a new story by giving us the same story and giving us a little bit of the original cast. I thought that they did such a great job of that. I said, if Jason Reitman wants to do Back to the Future, I'm all in.
The only thing I would say about that Afterlife is what they were able to do with Harold Ramis. They were able to bring him in.
That was awesome.
And they did it in such a tasteful way, in a perfect way. I know a huge challenge would be Marty McFly and what Michael J. Fox is dealing with Parkinson's. That would be a major challenge. But now that they were able to include Harold Ramis, maybe they could do it.
I think so. I think so. Michael J. Fox has acted since then. I think that, in a limited capacity, they could pull it off. That's me. I'm in the minority of the Back to the Future community. Most people don't want you to talk about recasting. They don't want to talk about another movie. Off with your head. I'm kind of the black sheep in the community who's pushing for it.
Well, I apologize if someone from the community does listen for the recasting and so forth. I really do. But I want to thank you, Brad. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it, and you allowed me to kind of relive my past and also talk about a little wrestling.
Hey, man.
Or is it wrestling?
Wrestling in the South. We call it wrestling in the South. But Robert, I appreciate you for having me on. And look, these movies, I've loved them all my life. I'll continue to love them all my life. And anytime anybody wants to stop and chat about them, I'm more than open to it.
I would like to thank my guest today, radio, TV, and podcast host and author, Brad Gilmore. And if you would like to get the brand new release of his recent book, Back from the Future, a celebration of the greatest time travel story ever told, simply click on the link in the description below. Our featured brew was Voodoo Ranger 1985 Hazy IPA from New Belgium Brewing of Fort Collins, Colorado. If you liked our talk today, please share this episode with a friend. And remember once again to subscribe to the podcast. If you want more information on authors and books, like the History A Go-Go Facebook page. The music was provided by the great North Carolina band Bones Fork. And if you'd like to get their new album, Beautiful Circle, click on their link. It's in the description below as well. And finally, I have to say to the list of listeners and supporters from around the world, once again, thank you. There are many more great episodes on the way. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.
The information in here is worth millions, and I'm giving it to you.
That's very nice. Thank you very much. Now, why don't you make like a tree and get out of here?
It's leave, you idiot. Make like a tree and leave. You sound like a damn fool when you say it wrong.
All right, then, leave! And take your book with you.